Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Kat Rosenfield. Kat is the author of 6 books, including No One Will Miss Her, Edgar Award nominee for Best Novel, and the New York Times best-selling A Trick of Light, co-authored with the late, great Stan Lee. Her latest is How to Survive in the Woods. A former reporter for MTV News and current columnist for the Free Press, her essays and cultural criticism have appeared in the Boston Globe, Vulture, Wired, AirMail, and the New York Times, and she lives in Connecticut. Welcome, Kat.
Thank you so much for having me. I almost said welcome to you. It's
Thank you. Thank
just
you.
starting things off real weird and awkward.
Well, we tend to do that. I think authors we're in our on our own in our little rooms for too much of the time to be totally smooth. But I love this book. I love this cover. If you're listening to us and not able to see, you got to go check out the cover of How to Survive in the Woods because they've done such a fun job with this woods and then in one very bloody blade sticking out from the trees. So before we dig in, Kat, tell us about How to Survive in the Woods.
How to Survive in the Woods is my attempt to combine the sort of 90s era sex thriller with a wilderness survival story. So what we have is basically like Basic Instinct, but with bears. And I don't want to really delve too deeply into the plot. Suffice to say, you have 3 people going into the woods with a plan that is not necessarily shared amongst all 3. Everybody has their own idea of what's going to happen in the woods, and some smaller number than 3 is going to come back out.
It's very well said. And you're right. There's so many fun twists and turns. I'm so curious about so Emma is our main character and she's sort of a unique person. So I was curious to know sort of the origin of Emma. And her job, and she's really and her backstory. And I don't know how if this is sort of all comes for you right at the beginning, you've got it all figured out, or if you sort of write a draft and she emerges in the process, because you've obviously written a bunch of books. So how does that work for you? Where do the characters come from? Are they fully formed? Are they in process?
So, in this case, I have modeled this story very loosely on a French thriller from the 1950s called Diabolique that I have been obsessed with for a very long time. My mother made me watch it when I was 12. She took my cinematic education very seriously. And so, this story features 2 women. One is the owner of a private school. One is a teacher there, and then a man who is the headmaster of the school. The owner of the school, the woman, I think her name is Christine, she's married to this guy. The teacher, who's a sort of a blonde bombshell type, is having an affair with him. But the 2 women are friends, and they decide that they've had it with this guy who is a real son of a bitch and that they are going to do something about it. This is all I'm going to say.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, and so the characters in this story are very, very loosely modeled on these 3 characters. You have a woman who's very confident, you have a woman who's very fragile, and you have a man who really deserves whatever is coming to him.
Amen. That's very, very, very true. Well, the thing I love about Emma is she's such a sort of, there's so much nuance to her that I think it's really important to sort of point out to listeners and to talk about because I think sometimes characters come across one way or the other. Like she is fragile and yet she's incredibly accomplished, right? She's one of those people who's done so much and yet some internal part of her is sort of always crumbling. And I think that's a really interesting type of personality. I mean, and let you see her differently. Maybe tell me what, I'm not sure if I don't want to speak out of turn, but in my
Yep.
mind, like, look at all she's done, look at where she came from and all she's succeeded and survived. And yet, like, there's some core part of her that just she never feels like she's sort of a whole human. And is what I
Mhm.
think is, I mean, until maybe potentially later, but that's the part I think is really interesting about her. And that seems to me to be a very nuanced character you created. So that's what I'm curious about. Like how do you create your characters?
Yeah, well, I mean, Emma, right at the start, you understand that there is the person she presents herself as, there is the person she perceives herself to be, and there is a series of choices that she has made that she considers to be the best for her. And one of the themes that I'm exploring in this book is the concept of survival. Each of the main characters is a survivor in his or her own way. And there are many different ways to be a survivor. There are many different things we might mean if we describe ourselves as survivors. Some people make survivor into an identity. Some people just kind of inherently are survivors. They're very hard to kill for whatever reason. And Emma, when we meet her at the start of the book, is surviving. Literally, she has just attempted to take her own life. It has not worked. And now she has to choose a path forward. And the path of survival that she chooses is to create a structure that will keep her safe. And you can think of that structure in two ways. One is I've made something to keep myself safe. Another way to think of it is I've made something to lock myself in.
Right. Right. Which I think is, and I think that feels so real and so nuanced and so unique. I don't think I've read characters that I think are defined in that way. And of course, I feel like that is actually it's a universal truth, right? In many ways, we all lean into systems and structures and that will sort of keep us safe from the outside world and also kind of keep us in a place where we can't really get to the outside world, right? There's this sort of duality to that, which I really appreciated. And so, I just am wondering about, as you write, are you somebody who's kind of got the whole story mapped out? Are you somebody who sort of has to find her way? How does that work?
I like to leave enough room to improvise while still having a sense of where I'm going. And so, what I do is I create something that I call a plot map. And it is a very loose narrative right through, very, very, very loose, of everything that's going to happen in the story in order. And when I have this document finished, what it will look like is, I mean, a mess.
Yeah.
But it's like, here's what's happening. Here are the plot beats in this scene. Usually, this is where I'll discover what the breakdown by chapter is, which tends to organize itself by scenes, much in the way that a movie or a screenplay would. And so there'll be the plot beats. There'll also be what is this character feeling? Where does this character need to get emotionally from the start of this moment to the end of it? I will often write little snippets of dialogue. That's one of the first things that helps me kind of find my way into a character is how do they talk to other people? How do they think about and relate to other people? And from there, I will start to usually try to write linearly, beginning to end. And will I know I know where the story is going. I like to leave room for things to happen. I'm not I would say sometimes I'm surprised by where I end up taking something. And but it's always about what would this person who I've created, what would they do in this situation? And having that be kind of the driving force, to just stay authentic to whoever this person is, I think is that's sort of the animating feature of the writing, and everything else flows from there.
I love that. And so how long approximately does it take you to sort of get to this sort of loose narrative outline?
It can take a really long time, or sometimes it's less. It really depends. I am a big believer in the power of like backburnering something and letting it sit because I think that the brain does things when you're not actively thinking about something. Problems resolve themselves. Things take shape back there without you thinking about it consciously. And so once I am sitting down to really write my way through a plot map, that's as long as I've allowed the story to percolate
Mhm.
to the extent that I want it to, um, it can take a day or a few days. It doesn't take a long time. The actual writing takes a really long time.
Of course, yeah. And the percolating process is interesting too, because I think some of the trick of that, and we always have a lot of aspiring authors and authors who are writing their very first books who listen to the podcast. And I
Mhm.
think that the idea of percolating is also tricky, right? Because it requires a sort of distance from the story. You can't think about it too actively. It's almost like a little fugue state. And so, what are you doing? Do you have things that are you a garden? Like, what are you doing while that stuff is percolating? Because I think it does require, like, I often think for me, it's my hands have to be doing something, right? But it can't be something that occupies my mind. So I'm either walking the dog or folding laundry or whatever it is. But, I'm curious to hear how that works for you.
Yeah, well, I definitely am a big fan of the long walk during which I mean, I sometimes will start listening to a podcast and then halfway through I'll be like, I'm not listening to this podcast at all. I'm thinking about my book. The other thing is that I am in my like kind of mainstream life, I am a journalist, a culture writer, and an essayist. I do have this job as a columnist for the Free Press. And so I have to be writing most days. And the thing that I really love about this other part of my life as a writer is that I am so often circling the same themes as a journalist as I do as a novelist. And I will find that I am approaching the same questions just from a different angle. And oftentimes I'll stumble across something in my work, either reporting or doing cultural analysis that will illuminate something for me about the story that I'm writing.
So magical. I
It,
mean, do you
it
think
can
that's
be.
is it by design, do you think? Or because are you coming up with your story ideas? Are you pitching ideas for the Free Press or are they assigning ideas? Because I would imagine if you're pitching, then of course it makes sense that all the same sort of themes are in your brain.
Yeah, I'm very lucky at the Free Press to have an editor who I've been working with for a long time. We have traveled together from one publication to another. This woman is like my heterosexual professional life partner.
Got it.
And um, it's it's interesting. She and I have similar areas of interest where, we'll get fixated on one aspect of one thing and, and end up talking about it, at length and kind of go galaxy brained about it. How does this connect to this other thing? What does this have to do with, say, this movie from the 1940s that I watched last week and this novel that I read a couple months ago? And like, how do they all come together? And I don't know. I love being in the soup of it. I think that oftentimes, even if I'm not directly writing about survival, for instance, with this book, I am touching upon other things like, for instance, the aftermath of the Me Too movement, which I've done a lot of writing about, and I'm looking at how women have moved forward from that moment in their lives, especially if they were an active part of the movement. Do they still consider themselves survivors? Have they made that central to their identity in some way? That was actually a very big part of writing this book, that I was doing this other kind of work, this other kind of analysis, very contemporaneously, that helped me ultimately understand my characters better because I was encountering versions of them or pieces of them out in the real world.
Yeah. And actually, it's so interesting. I mean, I think this is what is funny, these inspiration you're drawing from stories that are very, sounds like they're decades and decades old. And yet it seems to me that the male character in so many ways hasn't had to make the adjustments to the world the way that women have made so many adjustments. And so he could, he's the same, like you said, he's the man who's got it. Whatever's coming to him, he could very
Hmm.
easily have been that man in different clothing, 80 years ago, right? But the women, of course, have come through, and yet in some ways I feel like we're still where we were, right? We've come through all of this, like we're supposed to have, emerged greater, stronger, and yet in many ways, sort of we're dealing with the same themes that we've been dealing with for, 100+ years.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Can I swear on your podcast?
Absolutely.
I was gonna say a fuckboy is a fuckboy, no matter what era you're in.
Yes, it's so true. It's so true. Well, I find the dynamic of those women so interesting. I want to go back to, so it sounds to me like film and cinema is a big thing for is a big, inspiration for you. And
Mhm.
was your mother was she is that her in her world or just a passion of hers? Did you grow up sort of, it sounds like you got early education in cinema before most of us were watching those kinds of movies. So talk about that. Is it something that you draw from regularly or, did you learn that as a kid?
My mother took my cultural education seriously, not for any other reason than I think she wanted somebody to talk about movies with. My mom's a homemaker. She has a master's in public health that she never actually used. And so, but we would be at home together when I was a kid, a little kid, of course. And then, as I got to be older, I was a kind of a weird teenager. I loved to read, and didn't have very many friends. And so I was, spending a lot of time like watching movies with my mom or watching television or hanging out and reading books with her. And one of the interesting things actually of my cultural education is that my mother had very, very strict rules about what I was allowed to watch, especially on television. And it couldn't be stupid. And like
Yeah.
stupid was I think now looking back that she basically just created this rule so that there would never be anything on that she wasn't herself interested in. But I did develop a certain taste for and a certain understanding of, what makes for a compelling narrative and how you can translate narratives between different mediums. One of the other rules was that if I was going to be seeing a movie that was based on a book, I had to read the book first, or I wasn't allowed to see the movie.
I sort of feel like that's a fabulous rule. Like I
Yeah.
that rule for myself for sure. Having just finished Hamnet now, I'm like, okay, now I can go see the movie. But for sure, I think that's a great. I love that actually. I think it sounds like you had an outstanding mother. So
Yeah, she's still
wonderful.
around, still
Yes, you
outstanding.
have an outstanding mother. I love that. So you started in YA,
Mhm.
and how did that, how did you sort of start there, and what was what was the impetus for writing a young adult? Because it seems to me your voice, I mean, from what I've read, you have such a fabulous adult thriller voice. So, how did you end up starting in YA?
It's funny. I think that if I haven't looked at my first book in quite a while, but my sense is that my voice is pretty much the same in many ways, and that is really a function of when I got into YA. It happened to be at this moment that I refer to as peak YA, when there was just a lot of money in that world. And there was a lot of room for different kinds of writers to be telling different kinds of stories and to be experimental and to be weird. And so I was in this cohort of writers, along with, I mean, people much more successful than me, like John Green, but who were writing basically, adult, like sophisticated stories, with adult themes where the characters happened to be teenagers.
Yeah.
And this was what defined your book as young adult in that era. It was, is your character a teenager who is still in high school? And the very first book that I wrote, Amelia Ann is Dead and Gone, the main character has just graduated from high school. It is the summer after her high school graduation. And so it just was de facto a YA novel. And that was who ended up buying it. It was Julie Strauss Gable at Dutton Juvenile. And then I was working with her and I wasn't about to leave.
Right.
So I stayed in that world for a little while, but I think that, I did always have a more adult sensibility. And I think also that the moment that I was in with YA, that I was able to take advantage of, where there were so many people looking for sort of more sophisticated stories, it passed.
Yeah.
And now I'm more at home where I am.
Yeah, yeah, it all makes sense to me. And it's interesting when you wrote that book, did you have the sense that, oh, it's going to end up being a YA book because of the age, or was it sort of that was the book you wrote and that's sort of what happened?
It was more the latter. Yeah, it started out as a short story, and then this was 2008 when I had started to write it. The economy imploded, and I ended up unemployed for a really long time. And my husband, who I had just gotten married to, this poor, poor man, married a gainfully employed normal woman and ended up with like a couch creature who never took her pajamas off.
Well,
Um,
that's what marriage is, right? I mean,
Yes, yeah. And he said to me, I know that you have this novel half finished in a drawer. Maybe you should finish it now because nobody is giving anybody a job right now. And so, you'll never have an opportunity like this. So maybe just do that. And I did. And this was the story I ended up producing. And You know, yeah, because the main character was who she was, it just was a natural fit for YA. Although in another time, I think it could have been published as an adult book, just with a young main character.
Right? Which I think is much more common now, maybe than it was then.
Yeah, I think back to some of the other books that I've read, and I was thinking about like The Client, the John Grisham book. The
Right.
main character in that is an 11-year-old boy.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right. And nobody ever for a second thought that was going to be a YA book,
right.
but also maybe because of who he was. And even John Green's books, which I love, and they are, of course, labeled YA, but you read them and think, it's not something that doesn't appeal to plenty of adults. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
sort of gradation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was the era that was immediately post Twilight. And so an enormous contingent of the YA readership actually were adults.
Yeah.
And there was, I think, a sense, it wasn't necessarily talked about a lot, but we all knew that we were writing not only for teenagers.
Right. Which is lovely, actually. And
Hmm.
every spring break I ever took my kids on, I always went and bought like 8 YA books because I could read 5 of them in a week, and it was so
Hmm.
fun for me to take, a sort of brain break from, heavier, denser books that I was reading sort of the rest of the time. And also to show the kids like, hey, you guys should be able to read at least a couple of these in a week if I can read 5, right? So
Yeah.
so kind of, and I kind of miss those days, but I think a lot of us still pick up YA interchangeably. And so what was the book that then transitioned you from YA to adult?
That would probably be the collaboration with Stan Lee, I mean, to begin with, because we really did bridge that gap. It's interesting. A comic book story is where you get, nerds of all types. Everybody wants that. And working with Stan also, it was a chance to explore something much more plot driven than what I'd previously been doing. This was a superhero story. And so I got this kind of crash course from a master in how to create a more action forward narrative. And although I am now, back more to my comfort zone writing thrillers, mysteries, character driven stuff, that was very instructive just in terms of like, okay, not just how do I construct this, but what is popular? What does a gap bridging, age gap bridging narrative look like? How do we make this compelling to people of all ages?
Yeah, and I have to say, I think How to Survive in the Woods also has a beautiful balance between a very, very deep character texture and a lot of good mo movement. You're not bored, like there's no point in that book where you're like, oh, I'm just sitting on a log in the woods. Like it's got a very good momentum.
I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, super fun. So, and some people say absolutely not. I can't. Do you have a sense of what you're working on now? Um, can you tell us a little
Yeah,
bit about it?
sure. I am working on very roughly a retelling of Rosemary's Baby that takes place in present day in the world of high-end fertility technology.
I love it. So I love this. This is like, I feel like now I kind of have this like in my mind, Kat Rosenfield is this like, a movie influence, matched with some very modern, very different type of, world that we're living in. And that's sort of like, how fun is that?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, it's funny, actually, Rosemary's Baby, I read the book. This was
Yeah.
another thing that my mother gave me, um, long before I ever saw the movie. And so, and that's, Ira Levin, who also wrote Stepford Wives. He is such a master of creating this just sense of ambient dread.
Yeah.
And I think that there is so much potential to, harness that feeling to also explore the concept of infertility, which is, I mean, talk about something suffused with dread. I think, for women, probably more so than men, can relate to just, how powerful that might be.
Yeah. And my book that's out next month, actually, Pinky Swear, is about a woman who has idiopathic infertility and her best friend
Mhm.
agrees to be her surrogate. And then 4 days before the baby's due, she vanishes. So, yeah. So that
Ooh,
was, and
I got goosebumps.
thank you. And it is about, there is it is it is such a female thing. There's a lot of shame, right? There's a lot of shame attached to when your biology doesn't do what it's supposed to do.
Hmm.
And I think that is, and I think that touches women in all sorts of ways, the shame of
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes just being in our bodies. So I think infertility is, and I don't, another one of those sort of silent shames, right? We don't talk enough about it. People don't share stories. Lost pregnancies, 1 in 4 pregnancies, miscarry. And I
Hmm.
don't feel like women talk enough about sort of like that, what they go through. It's all sort of and it's devastating, so it's not easy to talk about. But on the flip side, like it's so universal. Why wouldn't we share, in
Hmm.
those
Yeah.
realities? So
Yeah, and I do love fiction as, a vehicle for kind of exploring stuff like that can be heavy, but you put it into a world of your own creation and it makes it manageable in certain ways. And I should say, this is another case actually where my work as a journalist has sort of dovetailed with my interest as a novelist. I reported a piece last year called "The Men Who Lost Their Babies," and it was about how men felt about pregnancy loss. And one thing that really stuck with me after that was that so many men, for the first time in their lives, many of them, this was the most complete loss of control they had ever experienced.
right.
And that's terrifying in a completely different way, in the sense of distance from something that is brutal and painful and that you can't do anything about.
Right.
So I think that I'm not necessarily going to be exploring that directly in this book, but having, spoken to all of these guys for this article, I think is going to prove valuable just as a sort of an input, in the back burner when it's percolating.
Yeah, and it isn't. I mean, it's exactly right. I mean, you do sort of, I have a tendency, of course, rightly or wrongly, to discount the male perspective when it comes to something that is, inherently happening inside the female body. But of course, the
Hmm.
loss is as real for them. And in many ways, are rarely confronted with such a loss of control, as you said,
Hmm.
until sort of something like that. So that sounds amazing. So this is super exciting. Well, we will be giving away a copy of How to Survive in the Woods over either on our Facebook page, Danielle's Killer Women on Facebook, or Killer Women Podcast on Instagram. Kat, tell our listeners where they can find you and figure out where you're going to be on tour and all those good things.
Oh, so my primary platform, I hate to say it, but I cannot quit it, is the site formerly known as Twitter. It's just I'm a creature of prose, and that's still where you go to write. I am also on Instagram, and I do post anything book related on there. On both platforms, I am Kat Rosenfield, KatRosenfield. And I think that's probably enough for people to discover me,
Yeah,
stalk
I'm
me.
sure also we could Google you. But if you haven't seen the cover of this book, go check it out. And you're definitely going to want to grab this one. I read it really fast. I just couldn't put it down. I really super fun and with all the right density too. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kat.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Everyone, we will see you next time on Killer Women. Bye.